Darkening cities, practices, perspectives and principles. This is the second session that Downey and myself have organised this conference, so thank you to the organisers for accepting our session proposals. And really what we're looking at through this session is different ways, building on the conversation yesterday, that we can think about places after dark and how we might start to think of different coexistences of light and dark in principally urban nightscapes and the benefits of those for human health, non-human health, and also in an era of climate emergency. Lots of wonderful speakers that are joining us today, 5 presentations in total, and the first is from Rob Short. So Rob, I'll invite you to speak now, so thank you.
Thanks for accommodating the shift in the timing of everything as well. So I want to think a little bit about nightlife specifically in terms of what's often described as nighttime economy, a phrase which I'm not a fan of at all, but which nonetheless persists, and how that connects and conflicts with, in various ways, research and academia and policy around light pollution. I want to start with a sort of a straightforward question. And I wonder if anyone in the room, and I know Taylor has, is there anyone else who has ever been to the artificial light at night conference? We have 3. I haven't. I suspect at a night studies event like this, the numbers are going to be pretty low who have interacted with this sort of framing of night studies around primarily nightlife and questions of urban darkness, and the framing of the night around questions of artificial light and its impact on people and environments. And I include, by the way, my own work today pretty much on this as well, I should say. So my central claim is that these are probably the 2 most studied areas across academia as a whole of nocturnal light. But that actually between the 2, there have been few, if any, interactions and conversations. And I turn to one of the places where there have been conversations between people working on nightlife and light pollution. The paper, which I'm sure most of you will know from Khyber and about 20 other scholars, including activists, including policy practitioners, which argues precisely for those sorts of conversations. The particular quote is worth lingering on. Due to the complexity of the night, it's essential to establish deep collaboration amongst social scientists, natural scientists, and humanists that unites empirically based understanding of physical or biological processes with similarly empirically grounded understandings of social, cultural, and historical processes. Complex social problems are unlikely to be easily fixed by techno-scientific solutions. So this is a call for those of us researching nightlife and people researching light pollution and darkness more broadly to have conversations and to start to think through, with empirical grounding in both the physical sciences and the social sciences and humanities, about the kind of shared problems. And there's this bigger question then of what sort of night studies or nightology is emerging as it starts to form a sense of a disciplinary identity. I want to outline a little bit more the trajectories of these 2 areas of research. The middle bullet point doesn't really exist as any slide, but please pretend that's not there. And then think through some of the connections, challenges, and kind of potential future transformation for the 2 areas to work together. Most of you, again, I'm sure will know this story, but it's worth doing it in order to kind of play it off against the light pollution one. And I sort of divided the history of these into academic, policy, and activist, although in practice, right, there's obviously crossed over. And in particular, I think clearly the academic interest in nightlife and nighttime economy has by and large followed where it has emerged as a policy matter in the first place. So academia has studied nightlife maybe it's kind of like a cultural phenomenon. I'm thinking really of sociology of kind of subcultures. In Britain, we've had something called the Mass Observation Project, which did a brilliant research using ethnographic and diary work in the 1930s into working class pub culture. And I think that a long, particularly sociological tradition of studying nightlife as in that sort of subcultural perspective. And then what we might call the nighttime economy studies, as far as I know, and I should say my history here is relatively Eurocentric. I think that my point about the lack of conversation between the two areas probably does stand more globally, but clearly, and I mean, come out with later, there are different traditions of nightlife in outside that kind of Euro-American context. Nighttime economy studies then was a merger, particularly in the UK in the 1990s. And really that ties into the policy history, and we've seen it grow. As I think probably nightlife has spread as part of urban boosterism and as part of urban development. And this then ties closely into the policy history. And you know, there was start with history, but I think we can identify that on the starting point of a tradition in policy of treating nightlife as a problem of control. Crime, deviance, or substance abuse. As far as I know, and Bianchini claims the term nighttime economy to Rome in the 1970s, and I don't know really about that claim as a part of cultural activity that took place there. And this really took place at a point as neoliberal forms of urban governance were exploding, first in places like Britain and America, but then more broadly globally. And it's nightlife and an active nightlife, I think, is a feature of how neoliberals imagine themselves to look. It's part of that competitive urbanism of having the waterfront bars and districts. A very crude distinction, though, in this is that there are quite different dynamics between, broadly speaking, kind of cold, temperate climate, which is of work in the day and then kind of purely socialising at night, and hotter climates, really kind of from around here in the Mediterranean, south either side of the equator, where there has been a longer tradition of other forms of work and labour taking place in the night, particularly in the early evening, but into much later hours than the sort of, I guess, more northern form of that have been translated globally. And then from an activist perspective, I think activists speaking for nightlife, so to speak, is a relatively recent phenomenon. We launched the Nightmares Vibe Lab and these NGOs have really come about only in the last couple of decades. But there's a longer history of activism around the night. It's been a space-time for outside of our history, and sort of deviance, crackdowns have long been met with forms of resistance, the carriage lanterns, the Stonewall riots. This was about right to nightlife in some way. And also, of course, the important history of feminist activism, the right to public space at night, the right to use the city. So there are these traditions of activism which are somewhat different from what's now emerged as a kind of nightlife. The nightmares, the nightlife, I'm trying to find the right word, but from people who are speaking for it, who are often positioning themselves and often then felt individuals positioning themselves, I think, in quite a spokesperson way. The light pollution then, I think what's one of the interesting points is that the history of understanding of light pollution, some of the timings are quite similar to nightlife emerging, I think, as a set of ideas. The term light pollution, I think, dates back a little bit older than the 1970s, but Regal's 1973 article in Science was a kind of marking point for growing concern amongst astronomers. And there is the observatory in Los Angeles, which sort of became redundant through from the 50s into the 70s. And it was an astronomical problem primarily. Ecological and biological research on the effects of light pollution also emerged around that time, but it was quite fragmented until the sort of late 1990s, when there started to be more of an ecological perspective. So you've had a slightly longer history of individuals studying the impact of light on species A, species B, but actually that ecological perspective of how light pollution impacts on interspecies relationships, on prey-predator relationships, is a more recent thing. And there has been some sort of interest. I'm not claiming there's not, we've heard some of it in this conference. But really only from the last decade or so. And I think it's dwarfed by the slightly larger research area, which has looked at artificial lighting, darkness, and urbanism. And again, we've heard quite a bit of that at the conference already. For a From a policy perspective, I mean, it's weak, right? On light pollution, there's very weak, if non-existent international frameworks. Lighting standards are actually the other way around. They're about the minimum of kind of the amount of lights that you need to provide, rather than the amount of darkness you need to provide. The International Dark Skies Parks, which are in places, which I'll come on to in a moment, are pretty much the driving thing behind any policy action. But the emergence of LED street lighting technology in the early or the late 2000s has started to create new capacities and promises, and I think the word promise is important there because they've not always been delivered. And that has interested in the municipalities in a variety of different places. From an activist perspective, then, really what we're talking about here is the International Dark Sky Association, founded in 1988. So a longer history than the Nightlife NGO is actually there, which is interesting. They founded their first dark sky preserve in 1993, and this evolved into the International Dark Sky Places Scheme. There's a very particular then territorial imagination about dark skies, which is kind of ironic, I guess, applying to bounded areas. And there's very extensive knowledge that has come from the RDA, doing brilliant work, I think it's fair to say, in establishing what makes for good non-polluting light. So if you go to their website now, there's infographics galore about how to light well in terms of actually providing light for every day, every night in terms of activities, whilst also minimizing light pollution. And where there is a will, actually this can be done. It's not the nicest example, but in Saudi Arabia at the moment, the new Red Sea big kind of holiday resort they're developing, it's going to be entirely dark sky based, and they have the money, they have the will, they can pay for consultants, and I suspect it will happen, and you will see their example at site, which is properly managed in terms of dark sky and people using it. Now that's going to be the people using that, they're going to be high-end tourists spending a lot of money. It's not an example at all for us to learn from beyond the case study of it showing that in principle you can design that way. But there's very weak knowledge then actually on how to implement this other than spending a lot of money, I think. So what about kind of current connections on these things? I've sort of tried a sort of traffic light type system of where there's very little connection in current debate and current understanding, through to where there is potentially a bit more. I'm going to start kind of at random around here. The arrow probably could be coordinated in a slightly better way. I'm a different time. Do tell me if I go too long. In terms of questions around sustainability, I think at the moment that there's very little in terms of nightlife and thinking about sustainability at all, really. I was interested to see actually that there was, that Miriam Milan had attended a sort of a nightlife and kind of urban ecology type event. We were promoting it quite recently, so there is a little bit of thought going on there. Minimal research that I'm aware of, which has really looked at nightlife spaces and any questions about kind of environmental sustainability. So that definitely gets a red line. Conceptualizations within academia around light, dark, and night. There's a little bit more engagement. A lot of it from some of the work that we're seeing at this conference on darkness in cities, on light festivals, on how to imagine different ways of inhabiting, particularly the urban. And similarly, then, light pollution people, whilst there's not a lot of thought perhaps about the experiential from a conceptual basis, I think there are connections there where people are thinking about perhaps what makes for good lighting. So there are kind of areas of ongoing thought which connect there. In both the policy and activist world, I'm aware of absolutely minimal connections between people who are trying to do things to raise nightlife as something to protect, particularly in the post-COVID context, and people who are trying to do any of the dark sky activism, and those two are obviously very close to coming together. Within kind of academic networking, well, there is a kind of orange. We have three hands here. We've been to Alan, that's more than none, and there are people working across those dimensions. So there's a little bit, I think it could be stronger. And then sort of lighting design and urban planning, I do think it's the one field, and you could almost have had a third kind of field in light pollution. You have light pollution, nightlife, and then sort of urban light design or something like that. Because as a field that does act as a little bit of a bridge between the more kind of pure and nighttime economy studies and the kind of light pollution side of things. So these are kind of current connections. I want to talk to challenges first, where actually at the moment processes of thought really aren't speaking to each other, but then also some spaces where I feel real kind of strengths of research which could start to communicate. So the first and perhaps most fundamental is the challenge between vibrancy and sustainability. As presented at the moment, claims about desires for vibrant active nightlights and claims about sustainability issues related to light pollution are basically contradictory. I think there's an urgent need amongst nightlife studies to start to think about how vibrant cities can also be sustainable cities. I think that this also then translates clearly into activism policy. Smart lighting is clearly part of the solution here, but remembering that quote, there isn't a techno-scientific bullet. Tourism, I think is interesting here. Both, I'll come on to later, both light pollution and this kind of nightlife have complex relationships with tourism, where there's a sort of desire to foster it as a way of increasing their area of activity, but that's also threatening commitment to the place in the community. So it's checking out to party in a vibrant city really a kind of sustainable practice to be encouraging, which many cities around the world do. We've heard about Krakow, lots of cities kind of have as part of their offer somewhere where people come to party for nightlife. Thomas Bernal reads excellent work on British stag parties going around Europe. This is not a highly sustainable practice. I think it's fair to say as well that from light pollution studies, there's a very limited sort of awareness of the value of vibrant nightlife. These people be seen much more comfortable working with rural communities where they can kind of darken actually kind of a village which maybe very vibrant or active beforehand than in an urban context. There's a challenge just fundamentally who's doing this. It is largely astronomy and ecology based in the world of light studies, light pollution studies. It's largely social science and humanities in the world of light studies. Interdisciplinary work will present and can present challenges as to what counts as good research, qualitative versus quantitative, report-based versus more perhaps kind of discursive book writing, artistic productions, and so on and so forth. I think there's challenges as well. I gave an honest like before, but I think there are challenges in how we think about night, dark, and light. And I think actually the second bullet point. So are we thinking about darkness or are we thinking about dark sky? There is a slippage between those two terms and they don't mean the same thing. Research which starts to think about how we encounter darkness and how we experience it, and how non-humans experience it as well. It's important to pull the non-humans in mind here, particularly when we're thinking about ecological impact. It goes well beyond looking up at the stars, and the importance of darkness is more important, I think, than dark skies purely. So I think that is a fundamental kind of contradiction at the moment, a thing that needs working out, and I think the continued need to start to think about continuums of more or less dark and more or less light is important, particularly in relation to questions about safety. There's the whole kind of light design industry versus light engineer binary, which I think that people may have touched on already and people are very familiar with, operating in that policy world. I think broadly speaking, Nightlife study probably underappreciates the role darkness plays in the production of lively urban atmospheres. Vibrant cities which are lit at night are lit against the black or dark canvas, and perhaps creative and interesting use of darker spaces within that within the nightlife spaces would be important. And I think light pollution studies, it lacks a kind of that interest and understanding of diverse ways of doing encountering the night, including encountering bright nights. The transformations, and a couple of slides on this. So I think one kind of shared point is prominence of the night. So both nightlife activists and the IDA and light pollution activists are interested in making night more visible in policy conversations. I think there's a space for it here as academics to be a real bridge there as well. between an activist and a policy world. There's a shared concern about the lack of visibility of night in most mainstream conversations about different subject areas, about planning, and in policy. There's an agreement that social justice requires a 24-hour lens. Social justice in terms of safety and people's right to use the cities at night, but social justice as well in terms of right to darkness. I don't think that these are completely inalienable and that's not right. These are completely kind of contradictory as ideas when we start perhaps to think not about the minimum themselves, but we bring it more to the question of socially just cities. So there is shared interest in different strategies and tactics of bringing the night to a policy. Well, I think perhaps a broader coalition might be more likely to achieve aims, because rather than just a nighttime economy activist speaking to people who are, I don't know, kind of planning policy, people, if you're also speaking about sustainability and environment in that kind of field, you're starting to build a broader coalition. I think there's a shared sense as well across the two areas about something about night and its core sense of being human. That kind of humanist idea of both night as core to kind of urban life, as core to what it means for a city to be a city, but darkness as core to the human condition. And in life, we've been scholars are always kind of keen to kind of remind us of the long history that we have as humans in relation to darkness and the stars and encountering them. And I think that there's a shared concern there. I think the importance of place and community, our alienation from them, is a shared concern in these areas. Both Nightlife and Light Pollution studies have explored how connections to place are threatened. And it comes back to that slightly complicated relationship to night tourism that both have. There have been lots of people who talk about nighttime economy and nightlife and expressed concern about where that gets lost to mainstream brands, to tourists, in contradiction to a kind of more local, organic nightlife. And I think that there's a similar concern amongst Light Pollution studies about a lack of connected place, about my dark side, darkness in my town, in my city, in my region. So I think that they're starting to embed questions of darkness and nightlife in relation to place is important. Neither areas have been brilliant. I think that any sort of like participatory type planning or agendas at the moment, although there are examples out there, but I think both could engage more with that. And then smart cities and smart lighting, I think these are obviously a shared concern because I think it's one of the papers in everyone's interest to get it right. So we've already seen through the 2010s that the rise of LEDs did not result in cities becoming darker as was promised. It's basically resulted in them becoming lighter because suddenly municipalities could use more light more cheaply instead of the rain, let's put lights everywhere. I think that there's the sense that smart cities could start to threaten from the alternative nightlife spaces, the spaces with LGBT people, which minorities and others have kind of carved out in cities. And I think that for both light pollution and nightlife, I think that this can be a topic of shared concern and engagement. So that's, I think then coming back to the kind of broader question of night study, I think there is an opportunity to present itself as a unique interdisciplinary field, which draws on, personally I would have a broadly but a loosely materialist understanding of the multiple ways in which nightiness and darkness are produced through our engagements with place. And I think that that's actually kind of a theme which can kind of combine these areas. And I think despite some of the challenges, I'm going to get this word used by the people. I find it the most awkward and horrible sounding word I can think of. But I love the bio, the geo, and the astronomical together really kind of capture the kind of sense of how we are in a kind of ecological, geographically specific, but also kind of sky-specific sense to connect with the dark. I think that some sense of these is fundamental to the human being is shared point. And questions about kind of the smart city, smart lighting, and making sure that they're going in ways that don't threaten particularly kind of making it easier. I think there are shared challenges and shared coalitions, and hopefully a research agenda for follow for many years yet. Thank you.
So I am going to speak about materials. day, and darkness, more specifically darkness as a material. This is a small, not small actually, about a certain part of my research. And I want to consider how the generative spatial potential of darkness as a material is important in a city that is slowly transitioning to turning off its lights, such as Paris, where I am doing my research. So we talked about this yesterday, so I don't want to spend too much time on it, but Paris is in a period of transition with lighting, moving to a more sustainable lighting model. And we all know, of course, this is positive and necessary development. And I think we all know the reasons for this in this room. So just a few things that are specific to France. The main lighting bill was passed in 2018. There's actually a very good article by Jean Barenton on the Dark Sky website that kind of explains all the details of the law. It says things like all monuments have to, turn off their lights at 1 o'clock, etc. It was not very well followed in Paris, certainly for government buildings, yes, but there are a lot of exemptions to the law. So today, as we discussed yesterday, we are seeing some of these things get done because there's an energy crisis, so a lot of people want to, jump on board. In between, in November 2021, the city of Paris specifically just awarded a new lighting contract. It's going to be about 10 years of work to redo all the public lighting. So that's street lighting, traffic lights, putting in some smart technologies. They don't know at this moment exactly what that will look like. Awarding the contract is a way they're still doing conversations with different groups in the city to see what people want, what they can do. So there are still some openings in all this to what this will eventually become. Your historical lampposts will stay, they'll just change a lot of the technology that goes with it. There are several test sites in the city already where they're experimenting with lights that are on timers or streets are turned off. So, as I said, I was not, as I didn't say, but I'm not really contesting any of these policy moves that are going on in Paris. I'm simply proposing that along with lighting, we broaden the solution base to include two readily available and interconnected resources, which is the built frame of the city and darkness itself. I tend to use the term built frame instead of, say, urban fabric. Because of the way we perceive the city at night, I don't know if I can turn on the lights. Should I turn on the lights? Yes? Yeah. You'll be able to see their pictures. For a city, is it this one?
Try.
Let's just go. There's no turn one on. We've got worse now. Is that better?
Yeah.
Do all six. Okay. So, yeah, just the way we see the city at night, the way in night our perspective is sort of framed by the architectures and infrastructure of the city. So the parameters of how we see space change at night. That's darkness alternately permeates, envelops, and reconstructs spatial experience. So of course this frame is very specific to Paris. I realize that the way Paris' footprint, its building technologies, and the materials in which it is built. But overall, I would suggest that the interactions between the built frame and darkness can, one, reduce the need for artificial lighting if we kind of start taking these elements into account, and serve as a catalyst for future architectural projects, whether they be permanent or temporary installations that are a little better adapted to anticipating the needs of nocturnal populations. Now, this, of course, requires a shift in thinking, and we've already discussed a lot yesterday, different ways of teaching future generations to include thinking about darkness. And to accept darkness as matter, as a material that, in concert with light and the built frame, can be used to shape nocturnal space. And thinking this way has the advantage of moving from an abstract view of darkness to darkness as a substance, which is important because the substance can be manipulated. And also I'd say that it establishes a complicity between traditional building materials and urban darkness to form composite materials, a materiality that is perceived differently from their diurnal aspect and is capable of altering our perception of the frame. Now, when Nick was putting together the text he wrote for this session, he mentioned that the potential of darkness in the creation of nocturnal atmospheres. Now, this word potential or possibilities is just not a hopeful notion. In my research, I use a lot of the term possibility and possibility as an analytic concept, much in the sense that Ernst Bloch used it. And this is kind of important because both Bloch and Henri thought of possibility as needing an inherent action to go with it. So I think it's fair to say that what Bloch described as an intention towards possibility has already begun. I mean, first of all, we're all here today and thinking about these questions, but in terms of urbanism, and with respect to each of the cities that we might be from, there is expectancy, or what Bloch would call anticipation of change. So we're all curious to see, darkness is changing, things are happening, but what are these new experiences of the night city that are going to be? What are these actions that are going to be taken? So admittedly, we'll use that same word, flux, and these spaces aren't flux. This is actually interesting because this slide, the Boulevard de Palais, runs down the middle of the Pier de la Cité in Paris, it's the middle geographically, the center of the city. And suddenly one night, all the public street lighting had been turned off, who knows why. And you start to get a sense, it's actually also interesting because the building to the right, and if you could see the building across the street, are already dark, and it's only it's 10 o'clock at night. They're both public buildings, so they've turned off their light. And interestingly, though, it's not really part of my talk today, they're fairly empty. A lot of empty the Palais because they've moved, and the hospital across the street because 80% of it isn't in use. And that gives a different feel also to the city at night, even to the facades, the front of this building, the sense that there is nothing on the inside of them. And then, of course, the peripheral lighting becomes more important, the traffic light, and traffic, the passing cars and buses to illuminate the scene. So when I talk about darkness as a material, there's many, many forms of dark matter. Shadow, of course, for one, but also celestial darkness. We don't always think of the way that the night sky, even the urban night sky, which also often is a little brown or a little yellow, actually contributes to spatial composition and experience, filling the gaps between buildings and alternately accentuating and enveloping roof lines. So in this image, which is Rue de la Lune, there's a sense of darkness descending, which in terms of building is interesting because rather than buildings that maybe rise up to fill space, you have a sense of darkness that is coming down and carving out urban space. And within that, parts of the building disappear because designing with darkness also means allowing buildings to disappear and being okay with that. Now, shadow is a really complex subject, which we can't really talk about in 15 minutes. But what's interesting to me is how shadow reconfigures space. We start to see, it eats away certain planes, it makes other planes with more attention to rise up. And it allows us to start to see what John Ruskin had referred to the force of dark masses. Of course, Ruskin was writing about shadow in the daytime. You have sun and it casts a shadow. There's rather a lot of writing in architecture or urbanism about how shadow works with buildings at night, and of course with artificial lighting. So what we see here is the emergence of alternate spaces. You can call them different rooms, you can call them alcoves, envelopes that are formed within darkness. And as I walk along the Seine here, I go through a sequence of these different sort of room ambiances. It's also interesting, I'm going to come back to this in a minute, but water, the effect of darkness as water itself, as a dark material, which is quite evident in the city of Paris. So material darkness is also observed in surfaces that absorb light, painted surfaces, matte surfaces, and also, as I just said, in nature. So where you have the vegetable wall, you have the feeling that light is absorbed. It's the same one later on in the evening, where you start to have a negative space. But what's interesting is that it shows also that darkness isn't necessarily void. Sitting at night sort of forces us to have a new definition of what a void is, because this particular case, what appears as a void, is actually an inhabited space, a space of dwelling. So in nature, material darkness is observed in many of these places, also in the parks, which look dark, and as I said earlier, in the center, which I'd have to say is probably in Paris one of the most apparent, I was going to say uses, but it's not uses, it was already there, material darknesses in the city that everyone sees. So the ability of darkness and light to reconfigure space has much to do with the underlying material, whether it be glass, metal, concrete, stone, and the finish of that material, whether it be reflective, porous, also the profile of the material, and the depth and the texture of the surface. These differences influence visibility. Reflective surfaces obviously have the advantage of expanding our cone of vision, allowing us to sort of see behind us at night, and also multiplying all the points of light that are available, even in very low light. Relief and depth also allow us to distinguish texture, not only as a decorative tool, but as a tool to navigate the city. This collection of images just happens to be all metallics. The uses of metal. There's two buildings here by François Soler in Paris. They use obviously a stage of metal springs in this one. But what's interesting is it does start to show you whether there's a lot more light in the background of it, how depth also affects the way the portrait, the facade of the building. Sorry to peek out on the little bit of architecture here, but it is important because it allows what we think of as really readers, the legibility of the context, and how we know where we are, because we can recognize some of these signs, recognize places that we know along our path. And here we have an example of a reflective surface and also a sort of a mix here. What's interesting in Paris also, of course, is the ground texture. You have stones also in Lisbon, but the Paris pave, besides being, they're all locally mined just outside of Paris. They have already an iridescence to them with, of course, the time and hundreds of people walking over them every day. It gives them a sort of patina, which is reflective also at night, that allows you to see a little better. And the glass, the trees, everything, you start to get a sense of what this material can be. And studying this central, you'll see that I'm very much taking pictures in central Paris, or what you might call the historic part of Paris. And it's a conscious choice that I made because while the city is in transition, I seem to have a lot of dark pictures, but there's a lot of areas that are brightly lit with sodium light still. It allows us to look a little bit about how the classic visual frame of Paris does react to darkness with the materials that we already have, and to show us a little bit more about how we might use that darkness in the future. I'm just going to end up pretty soon because I did millions of slides of materials, so I'm not going to worry you with that. I just wanted to spend a minute. Glazing is another surface of glass for you, is one that is a material whose perception depends on both exterior and interior lighting, becoming sometimes opaque, sometimes transparent. So studying darkness has made me very, very aware of the sort of peripheral and unpredictable and dependable lighting, if you will, that comes from windows, but also street lights, cars, well, things that are moving, bicycle lights, This particular street had absolutely no public lighting. So the only way I was able to see once my light adjusted, I guess, bicycles passed me, people with cell phones, and of course, whatever light from windows might be coming through. Another sort of unpredictable source, a temporary source, are this building happens to be wrapped in a sort of tissue because it actually had problems, so they're repairing it. So they wrapped it in sort of this construction netting, which forms a bit of a cocoon, and you start to see with these temporary materials perhaps different ideas for other types of facade treatments that can be very interesting. And I don't get very specific here in that detail, but it does also show you the place that light still plays an important role in how we perceive materials. So I think today, I'll go to the end real quick. I don't want to take for too long, but yeah, so Jeff was on the interior and exterior and the importance with the built frame, but I think today the possibility of in the Paris night stems from a reorientation of design approaches to include sensibilities of material darkness, its perception, its codependencies within the built frame of the city with the different materials. So I conclude that building with darkness is, in the current climate, not only a necessity, but almost an act of resistance, a means of enabling possibility. And I'm going to leave you with that.
Before I get started, a few things to frame this short presentation. Also a bit reacting to what I just heard. So first, just to keep in mind where I'm coming from, so I work in philosophy of technology, and I'm most interested in how to incorporate environmental values into the design of our technologies and infrastructures. So with this talk, I'm going to sort of ask you for a few minutes to zoom out, figuratively and literally, with a lot of these pictures, and think more about the concepts and ideas around questions of darkness and darkening cities for the next few minutes. And in relation to that, just to sort of react a bit to this conversation and Rod's great presentation. I'm definitely coming a bit more thinking about environmental values from, I guess, the light pollution studies camp team, whatever, that side. Although I would say, in a sense, if we were sort of trying to nuance it a bit, I think operating a bit more in this sort of nebulous in between space and starting to work more with lighting the secondary. But also the philosopher, sort of nebulous space would be a definition of our field. And the last thing I would say is this is very much a work in progress. So this is the first attempt to outline a future paper that will be written about dark skies, principles and practices. So I'm very much looking forward to your feedback, comments during the Q&A, afterwards, via email to the few people online. Yeah, please talk to me and give me some feedback and advice. Okay, so let's down. So, okay, you can't see the name at the bottom, but there's a way in. A recent project, this just happened less than 2 weeks ago. I'm not sure how much this made it into international news. Yeah, this people have saw this, heard of this? A little bit? Turn all the lights up. Yeah. So basically, there's a design studio in the Netherlands called Studio Roosgaard. They work a lot with light. They have a lot of really interesting, somewhere between art design, lighting interventions. Their latest project is a partnership with UNESCO called Seeing Stars, where they're teaming up with different municipalities to turn off the lights, all the lights basically in the city for a few hours for a night. And then have a bunch of cultural events and so on that go along with it. And yeah, I mean, Leiden is not a huge city, it's about 150,000 people, give or take, but still, you can analyze this project from many angles. I mean, one, just to hear how they convince the municipality to do this. I'm very interested because they're also saying they're now talking with bigger cities like Sydney and Stockholm, so how they can actually do this, that's impressive. But also just to think about what this idea is underlying this project, what they're trying to bring attention to, which is, of course, light pollution. and this topic, which is underlying a lot of the discussion in this panel and a few yesterday as well. So yes, to bring attention to the impacts of light pollution, that it costs billions of dollars, has effects on biodiversity, has effects on our health. But I would say the main drive of that project, in the Seeing Stars project, is to bring attention to this idea of sky glow and the loss of the night sky or the dark sky in our daily lives. And importantly, that it's within our capacity to actually bring it back into our daily lives. And so this is the way in, and there's sort of two ideas that are interacting for this paper or presentation that have motivated it and underlying it. And one is this idea when we start talking about dark design, designing with or for darkness, and approach it from a perspective of environmental values, environmental ethics. Underlying it, it seems to me, is this idea of darkening cities as a type of urban restoration, urban ecological restoration of some sort. And so to sort of start to tease out exactly what we mean by this, what we're striving for in a bit more detail when we start talking about darkening cities from this ecological or environmental perspective. And two, a very interrelated idea and tension that is perhaps obvious, but again, as a philosopher, I think deserves some discussion and reflection, is when we start talking about darkening cities and our relationship with darkness, are we talking about darkness itself, or are we talking about artificial illumination? And to what degree we can and should disentangle these two ideas. And this draws a bit from philosophy of technology literature that talks about something called mediation theory. So this idea that we no longer directly experience the world, but only experience it through different technologies. And these, in turn, shape our perceptions, experiences, behaviors, and evaluation of all scales, ranging from classes to the infrastructures of our cities that we now live in and through. And so, underlying this is in this question of, if we're talking about restoring urban darkness, it seems that we're really talking about repairing our lighting infrastructure, and repair in a broad sense, fixing it or trying to reintroduce a specific value or goal into the design policy of our lighting infrastructure. So what it really means to restore darkness through our lighting technologies, and how these two ideas interact. And so this is sort of the theoretical idea, and the lens is what I mean by repairing the night, is how we can actually start to use the ideas of maintenance and repair from philosophy of technology, infrastructure studies, urbanism, as mainly conceptual tools to think through urban darkness and the restoration of urban darkness. So bear with me for a second, I'm going to get into some theory slides, but I'll get back to pictures of dark skies soon. So just to quickly go through where I'm coming from and talking about maintenance and repair. And some recent literature that I think gives some nice conceptual tools to think through urban restoration, urban darkness. So the first is this idea of technology as a process. So one way to think about maintenance is an act of providing stability over time, which also falls into this idea that artifacts are themselves static. But another way to think about technologies is that they're actually processes that are extended and guided through time, often through acts of repair and restoration, as well as environmental impact on them. Anyone who owns a bicycle or car, think and attest that these are not static things, but actually are dynamically evolving. And with greater scales and infrastructure, this is even more true. And this, in a sense, it connects. I liked yesterday, Nick mentioned, I think it was even said this idea that we should see cities as processes, right? As these emergent processes. And in the same way, infrastructures like lighting can be seen as processes. They're never static and they're never complete in a true sense. But they are changing at different time scales and different levels, but these are evolving systems. And related to this is this idea of reflexivity or self-awareness in acts of repair. And this is something that is discussed within the framework of living within the Anthropocene or within a climate crisis, biodiversity loss, whatever term you want to use, our current situation. That infrastructure is often operated at scale where their impact play a major role in shaping their own operating environments. And they get into these feedback loops. And so you can actually see light pollution in this way. That light pollution is an impact of artificial lighting technology, which is now in turn shaping the policy and design choices of artificial lighting technology. And the third idea from the same book is that you should see repair as having a material and a social function. So it's not just literally repairing an artifact or system and its functionality, but often it's also repairing different social relations or values. So in a sense, you can extend this to say, okay, if you see restoring darkness as a way to repair our lighting infrastructure, there is in a sense a material, there's an instrumental side of saving money, providing ecosystem services, dealing with or ecosystem functions, but there's also underlying this question of relations and evaluations and values and perceptions of the night. Which I see, again, putting on the philosopher's hat, is one of the most interesting aspects of it, and perhaps one where it starts to relate most closely with questions of dark design or lighting design as a process as well, beyond just the technical, the engineering side of it, let's say. That if we think about darkness as urban restoration in this way, and as an act of repair, it's more than just repairing this infrastructure or this technology, replacing its light bulb. It's also an act, if we see it in this way, and conscientious sustainability really move in this direction of repairing our relation to urban darkness, and or perhaps more accurately, as Rob maybe pointed out, our relationship to the night sky as well, which is, of course, with these light pollution and with the project I started with, and we'll loop back at the end. This is really the drive, right? This is what they mean by urban darkness and darkness in cities. It's a very specific feature of it. And so this is the philosophy stuff. So just to quickly, okay, then to try and link it to a little bit of practice, very quickly. And how much time do I have? All right. All right, I'll slip it. But just so thinking through this is so what does this actually mean then for strategies to think through lighting infrastructure and to repair the night? Some that are out there that I've actually just mentioned, and a few that I've worked on. But I'll go through quick, and we can always discuss after. Just to sort of make the first link to what so this group and the researcher was just mentioned, and France has come up several times as one of the places where a lot of this interesting research is happening. So one of these things at this larger scale is thinking through these ideas of dark corridors or dark ecological networks, like other types of wildlife corridors. So this is taking a bit more of a macro scale in thinking about where we strategically want our darkness and how this aligns not just with human users, but also more than human users of these spaces and regions. Another project that I've been working on a bit and collaborating with the lighting design firm that you can't see from Rotterdam, called the LEK, Lighting College in Dutch, is thinking through and trying to move away from sort of a binary view of lighting. And perhaps, again, as Rob said, this common idea of trying to get it right with these new smart lighting technologies, and asking if we expand both the stakeholders that are involved, but also think about how you can start to exploit these different potentials of this technology, what you can do with it. So this is a conceptual project they've done, the firm that they call Light Passport, looking at a bridge in Rotterdam, and sort of been trying to say, okay, we know these different species are using it, and there's research emerging that says these colors of light, this amount of flux is important for these species, and we start to know their yearly cycles and even the daily cycles of when they're used. Could this actually be used as input for a dynamic lighting system? That could create a more responsive system, and could also start to factor in things like ambient lighting conditions, so it's not just a static on and off. And how this would start to change how we interact with light, and how this, again, mediates our experience of the city or the world at night. And another project with the same firm I'm working on is trying to translate this urban planning idea of urban acupuncture into lighting design, and think about dark acupuncture as an idea. So rather than a top-down urban lighting master plan of the whole city, think about where there are these strategic moments of intervention, where we can focus on specific experiences and revitalize spaces and offer different experiences or perception of darkness and night. And so I won't get into this. We just had this paper published, but one of our first projects was trying to come up with a vision for a park in the Netherlands, where we tried to develop this theory, but also apply it to this space. And it ended up, again, we sort of, instead of doing a big master plan, we sort of started with the bottom up and tried to identify where these hotspots or problem areas were, and ask what different solutions could be used for these specific sites, where we could preserve darkness, where we could potentially add new light, and where you could take away light, and how we could see the park as sort of a pinprick itself in a larger area of South Holland, which is one of the brightest areas in Europe. And how we could see this as a space of fostering at least different or positive experiences of darkness within it. It was well received. We worked with the local stakeholders on it. It has yet to be realized, but stay tuned. Maybe in a future conference I can present what happened there. But the plan is out there, and the is out, and hopefully it can continue and evolve in space in some way. And then some other more sort of speculative design ideas with future design thinking about how you can take pedestrian spaces, this one is in Jakarta, and reintroduce the sort of question of what are we missing and what is lost within these brightly lit environments, and even how you could start to use what lighting is there to align with natural rhythms and cycles as well, and colors. And so just by way of a conclusion, just to come back to this original idea of urban restoration, urban darkness, and this idea of inventing cities rather than predicting the future. So one little anecdote from the Netherlands, which I spent a lot of time in, and I did my PhD in Delft, so we'll show it for that. So in this recent book on biophilic design, there's this really nice anecdote where they talk about how street trees in the Netherlands were actually invented. So, okay, they didn't invent trees, that's one thing they didn't do, but this idea in modern cities of bringing trees onto the street was actually originally an idea it was brought in to help stabilize the banks of the canal. And then it was promoted further because of the aesthetic reasons. Now, of course, we know that urban canopies and urban forests have very clear economic and health benefits. But this idea, I really like that this was, we have to remember that this was still an idea, an innovation or a convention, if you will. And I also really like this quote, the book New York Nocturne, which really mirrors this, and this idea that artificial light sort of invented this new category of natural light. And I would say in a lot of ways, it also invented this new category of natural darkness, and the sort of conceptualization of natural darkness. And to a certain extent, this is when we talk about dark design in cities, and we're trying to think through, and as Claire was sort of saying, what it means to bring darkness back into cities. It's a sort of question of how we're trying to reinvent or rethink what urban darkness is and means in this contemporary context. And just to return to this art project I started with, and one last quote that I like in this discussion from a philosopher about what we mean when we talk about urban restoration. And he describes it as finding new stories and breathing life into an urban story that's fallen into decay, so we find meaningful, valid, or good. And when we consider it from an ecological or environmental perspective, I would say, if I could humbly, boldly speak on behalf of some others who work in dark design, this idea of finding a new story for urban darkness is very much what this field or this line of research is. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think my presentation would be put in conversation with Nick's talk on nocturnal practice from yesterday, and also with the narrative approach of the conception of the city presented by Elena and their colleagues earlier this morning. Okay, so my research begins with the premises that first, light is central to understanding the Arctic as a region, and second, the Arctic provides unique settings for studying human relations with light. Common geographic definition maps the northern polar region by the Arctic Circle, an imaginary line drawn at the latitude approximately 66 degrees 33 minutes north. This line also marks a region with distinctive light conditions, where the sun never rises for at least one day in winter and never sets for at least one day in summer, and we call it summer day, polar day and polar night. Hence, seasonal changes in light, the northern environment challenges common imaginaries of the day as bright and the night as dark. In the far north, a day-night change does not signify a regular drastic alternation from light to dark. And here on the slide, you can see the location of my fieldwork, and my discipline is social anthropology. For 9 months, from September 2021 to June 2022, I lived in a small town above the Arctic Circle called Tiksi, and it's in the Siberian Arctic. Experiencing light conditions in the far north led me to question about human relations to place, both the town and surrounding landscape, and the ways in which light and dark shape those relations. To explore this question, I walked, experiencing space by intentionally focusing on light and dark and recording these experiences. My sensations and experiences were recorded either simultaneously while walking or retrospectively from immediate memory. And today I will present two narratives from my night walks around the town. Okay, walk number 1, April 7th, 10 p.m. minus 22 Celsius. Tonight, the town is much less illuminated. I realized that I should go outside, but a feeling of fear and a premonition of cold stops me. I make an effort, I force myself, I put my warm clothes on and go out. I walk around main streets of the town and record my narrative on a tape recorder, holding it near my ear like a phone so it doesn't look like I'm talking to myself. A main town square is brightly lit, and it feels like everything around it is pure darkness. Per usual, there's nobody in the streets, just a few cars passing by. I pass the square into the street where the street lights are off. Scary. Abandoned buildings with empty windows silently stare at me from the dark. The moon shines from above. Habitually, when I walk in dark streets, my ability to see entrances, I start to see stars and the sky becomes more colorful. How scary it is here. I could never walk alone on the outskirts of the town. This street is in total darkness tonight. I don't feel anything but fear. I turn around and take a photo of the apartment building where I live now. It shines with bright lights at a distance, while frightening darkness surrounds me. I continue walking. I think that the problem lies in the fact that I can't have any relations with this town, and that is why I'm not able to write about it. I don't want to deal with this town. I don't want to walk into these dark streets with abandoned houses. Tundra in darkness is so much more attractive than all this horror. I don't know why everything this town is here. It feels like I'm alone in the whole town. It feels like a polar night now. I don't know how I survived the polar night here. At the moment, I feel the same tingling feeling of dread, slow fear creeping from everywhere on me. I don't know how to describe this with words. What kind of phenomenology of place could it be? Blackboarded up windows lit by bright streetlight or in darkness? I do not know what it is. Why is it here? Boy, how much I want to run away as soon as possible. I continue walking. I think I see the third person at the entire time of my walk. I need to focus on the details. Because the streetlights are so bright, my vision is different from when I'm turned up. I don't know why to photograph this. So what do I see? This is the street. Streetlights are on the left, parted by a relatively large distance from each other. The whole street is lit by stripes: a streak of light, a streak of darkness. A store, ironically called Any Whim, shines with green stalker and light. Across the street, there is a library and a field with great windows. There is a cat in the window. A purple window has special lighting for growing plants. From here, the sky seems black, scary. Some windows with colorful lights are joyful, though I see an abandoned building with empty dark windows right near me. Now on my left and on my right, I have abandoned buildings. I'm walking in the darkness between empty buildings with boarded windows. At the corners, they are lit by streetlights. What is about the terminology of that place? Everything inside of me that is out from horror. This street is bright. I think I will walk there. The fourth person is walking by. I'm walking on a brightly lit street. The light is reflected on the nice road with faces and lights in the windows. The new complex for culture and sports is always lit nicely. They have decorative lights and posts around the building. This is the only place in town that reminds me about a different life. This light design creates a lively atmosphere and brings memories of other places. I look left. This part of the street with shops farther down is brightly illuminated. On the picture, the light sources look like stripes. They are too bright to look at, blinding spots of light everywhere. How can I write about something that I do not relate to? I walk to another corner and turn to the left. The light posts are very low here. Someone said it is because they don't have a technical ability to maintain high light poles. They're so bright that I can't even look at them. All street lights are on the left with double luminaires. Half of them are not working. If they were now street lights, I would not leave the house. What does light do to this place? Possibly it gives us ability to live here and not to run away. I don't want to say that darkness is horrible. In fact, darkness in tundra is beautiful, but darkness in this town is just a quintessential horror. Darkness is different then, depending on the place. Here, light fights with darkness, but even light itself is toxic, aggressive light, not comfortable. But at least it allows us to move around. I'm not sure whether this light disguises or reveals the character of this place. It seems like darkness conceals everything, but here, on the contrary, darkness heightens the feeling of the town. Illumination changes the town's topography at night, highlighting some elements and concealing others. Light also takes away the sky, the spark, everything that lies beyond the town. This light conceals anything that exists outside of the urban space. It doesn't allow me to go anywhere else. It prevents me from living. The border, not between the light and the dark of the town, but between the town's illumination and the rest of Tandra's darkness, as seen from the town, becomes a borderline with a kind of cross. What did I learn from the process of walking? Well, taking photos and recording myself. And again, what you heard about was a rough translation of my speech recorded in Russian. I enjoy writing more than audio recording. When I speak to describe what I'm experiencing, it is a less intense process compared to simultaneous writing. But one cannot walk around at -22 Celsius. I forced myself to experience the town, and I forced myself to write about it. There was no spontaneity or spark in it. The town at night seemed to be such a closed-off space with a rigid structure, the lighting, which on the one hand made it possible to function here, but on the other hand blocked visibility of any other light, the sky, sea, and tundra. The town felt like a trap at night. Walk number 2. April 14th to 20 p.m. minus 15 Celsius. I walked with a friend, mostly in silence, sometimes interrupted by a small chat. I took pictures and tried to notice light conditions along the way. My attempts to talk light with my co-worker failed as they were preoccupied with other more prominent matters in their life. I described my experiences later on, writing from memory while looking at the photos I took during the walk. I stepped on the road that goes around the town and took my first picture. We were walking south. On my left there was tundra, and on my right there was the town. It felt colder than the thermometer showed. The usual, there was no people outside at this time. The sun set down already an hour earlier. The road and tundra covered by snow were almost the same color with the sky. Mute, light blue and gray hues with very soft light created a tender and calm atmosphere. This light and colors seemed to unite tundra, sea, sky, and road onto one endless open space. The town looked differently. Dark constructions and scattered debris interrupted the fabric of the space. This effect was enhanced by dark gray clouds and dirty orange and pink hues on the horizon behind it. These two different experiences of space were shaped by light and colors. As I walked along the road, looking forward, the beauty of the endless, curved, light gray landscape was slowly unfolding before my eyes. The farther I looked, the less infrastructure and debris I saw. Uninterrupted space defined only by hills looked like it was made of cottonwood. Calm, soft, and inviting, despite of the cold and the scale, bodes deadly to unprepared humans like myself. Microtypography of snow reminded me of a wavy sea. The edges of snow were lit brighter than the rest of it, creating a complex pattern of untouched surface. The town had some street lights on, as well as lights in the windows at the residential apartment buildings. It was getting darker. The road turned to the northwest, and I started to move toward the sunset sky. The street lights far away were coming closer. There was a definite moment when we stepped into the area of the road illuminated by streetlights. It changed the atmosphere dramatically. The endless white landscape disappeared together with a feeling of grandiose but calm beauty. Though there was no movement, the sensory and visual busyness of the place became evident. Even the sky seemed less visible and darker. The yellowish light overpowered the bluish whiteness of tundra. On my right, the town was lined in blue shadows with bright yellowish and purple dots of windows. Some asphalt of the road began to appear on the snow, adding dark colors to the already untidy place. The road stopped being a borderline between the town and natural space as it curved inside the urban space. On my left now, there was a bay. A very bright line of streetlights illuminated the seafront. The bay was filled with debris of abandoned piers and ships, which was different from the almost pristine tundra I saw earlier. Here, the town spilled itself into the sea more noticeably than in tundra. This line of electric lighting served as a marker between the urban space and the bay. As it got progressively darker, the colors of the sky saturated on the horizon. In town, the feeling of softness and beauty disappeared. Electric light came from very defined sources and was often blinding. As we walked by, the brightest streetlights in town went on. My fingers were frozen like my whole body, and the desire to go home grew. I took my last photo of this walk facing the apartment building from afar. What did I learn from this process of walking and then writing from memory and photos? While my memory of the walk is still fresh, writing at my desk is very different from being outside. Sometimes I discover something on my pictures that I didn't see while walking because other senses were involved then. I find that my writing from memory or retrospective writing is pretty much structured by my visual notes or pictures lately. Strange familiarity of the town where I have lived for the last 7 months at this point was marked by the streetlights. The quality of their light was constant, connecting times to seasonal changes, from fall to spring until they're no more needed in summer. The streetlights were constant markers of the urban space, pushing out natural light and natural space, erasing the sky and tundra. I was blinded by them if I tried to look directly at them. Yet the road and the seafront serve as borders between urban and natural spaces, less so in daylight. At night, the road and the seafront seem to mark these boundaries, especially where the lines of streetlights were placed. The streetlights interrupted the fluidness and connectedness between the two, the town and the surrounding landscape.
Thank you.
Darkness, and this is a study through the lens, and it has his main focus on shadows. I'm gonna talk a little bit where I'm coming from. So I'm a visual artist, and I begin my research by looking. I've talked about night drawing, a project I initiated in 2018 on other occasions. Today, I'm talking about my practice as a photographer, which has been shaped not least by the fact that I draw at night. What I will discuss is work in progress, and it's part of my thesis, What is the Matter with Darkness? A practice-based investigation that presents a new concept of urban darkness. It is conducted through photography and drawing, two media that have made a crucial contribution to observing how light affects our phenomenological perception of darkness. The following presentation is a visual essay that offers a critical creative reflection on the matter of darkness as it relates to our spatial awareness and aesthetics of the night environment. The analysis is situated at the intersection of theory and practice, a philosophy of atmospheres and media ecology, and aims to tackle the following questions. How does artificial light operate to make the dark visible in urban areas? How exactly are light and darkness physically visible, related, and photographically translated? My research aims the under-investigated question of how artificial light affects the presence rather than the absence of darkness in the nocturnal cityscape. Most studies on nighttime lighting address safety issues, light pollution, and loss of darkness, but there is little discussion of how darkness is also created by and understood through lighting practices. To better understand urban darkness, one must understand methods of representing light, which has its origin in the shadow and is therefore closely related to how photography has shaped, mapped, and presented light over time. I turn my attention to shadows because I believe their appearance and our conception of them are crucial to exploring our contemporary understanding of darkness at night. Photography is based on light, but a photograph would be meaningless and illegible without depicting shadows, therefore darkness. The same idea can be applied to city lighting at night, which not only illuminates important urban landmarks, but also extinguishes others and turns unattractive areas into deep darkness. 9 years ago, I attempted to depict darkness without the aid of artificial light in the Galloway Forest Park in Scotland. Within its deep, dark setting, I was determined to try and fix the natural phenomenon and atmosphere of darkness onto a negative with my camera. After several midnight attempts of producing very long exposures, I learned that my own perception of the tonalities of darkness was not that of a camera. I remember my great disappointment when I got my developed roll of negatives from Galloway First Park back. They were mostly blank. To this day, my night excursions end in transparent negatives with barely any traces of light. This result is neither surprising nor new, nor is it surprising that I, as a photographer, need evidence of the disconnect between the human eye and the lens. Today, I have a very different understanding of this experience, and I almost regret that I saw many of the negatives as useless and threw some of them into the bin. What I like to discuss in this session are some questions of visual understanding and the use of photography beyond its documentary purpose of illustrating an after image. I think we have learned from media theory that the visual is a powerful and influential tool for various forms of life. The night lights in cities provide a case for further exploring representative visual effects. My questions through all of this are whether we can look at images and the use of photography as a tool to rethink and reimagine urban darkness. Artificial light at night makes the city look like a photograph. I argue that to better understand darkness in the urban night, we must also consider the shadows of nighttime artificial light. I describe my concept of urban darkness from this point of view, using three types of shadows: cast, attached, and overcast. I modify this shadow terminology after Michael Paxendall books Shadows and Enlightenment. There are many implications within the shadow types, yet the structure I use provides a practical illustration for my purposes. This typology is perhaps an oversimplification, but also a useful way of making sense of urban darkness. Nighttime is in the shadow of the earth, and in order to escape the shadow, we create sources of light, which in turn throw more shadows. Within the tremendous focus on the light, with darkness as its binary opposite, we lose the ability to truly see darkness. The central argument of my research is to emphasize how essential darkness and shadows are to understanding both human visual perception and forms of representation. I focus on the photographic image as a starting point for investigating the visual properties of artificial light and recognition of darkness in the urban landscape. Shadows within our environment influences our experience of light and our lighting needs, and vice versa. Michael Beale and Tim Floor-Sørensen note shading light on objects is about attributing perceptual form to the objects, and hence the social use of light is not as much on the object as it is for the object. It is remarkable that Western foundations of representation in art, as well as a theoretical knowledge, both originate in a mist of shadows, which feature in Plato's cave as well as in Pliny's tale of the Corinthian maid penciling her lover's shadow as a silhouette on a wall. In his recent book, Photography and its Shadow, Hagi Kenan claims looking is the condition for recognizing the shadow's presence, to free ourselves, in Heidegger's terms, from the tendency to focus on the object itself. In reference to Pliny's story, Derrida notes that the maid traces the shadow of her lover without looking at him, fallen away from the thing itself, detached from the presence of perception, drawing those, Derrida claims, originate in blindness. Looking at urban darkness, I like to contrast this perspective to focus on the shadow rather than on the object, thus the light itself. The cast shadow sets a dark contrast in the background. Cast shadows belong to objects and form a crisp duplication of the object somewhere else. This happens when the surface of the object blocks light from passing through to fall on a surface that is separate from the object, as when traced the lover's shadow on the wall in Pliny's tale. The cast shadow is probably not only the most familiar shadow that we conceptualize, theorize, and perceive, it is also the darkest of the shadows. The philosopher of color Hardin notes, by adding light, do whites become whiter, blacks get blacker. City lights at night illustrates Hardin's account. A cluster of brightly lit night spaces makes the immediate environment, including the sky, appear brighter, while making surrounding darkness at the edges seem to appear even darker. The visual effect of artificial light at night, its contrast, is by artificial light at night by contrast and its consequences on darkness can be easily simplified and understood with the photographic basics film and camera illustrated as follows. The image on the left shows a brightly glowing night sky, common in major cities on account of light pollution, that makes the outline of objects, in this case a hedge, on the ground stand out from the sky. The hedge in the photograph is cast in its shade, rather flat but noticeable through the contrast between the dark shadows and the lit sky. When all variables in the sensory, film, and camera mechanism are constant, long exposures increase the amount of light in a photograph. Therefore, it not only increases brightness, but also the contrast with darkness. The image on the right shows a kind of fading out, a reverse loss of information by light compared to the left image and its lack of perceptible details in dark areas. The image actively alters the light by using a flash that brightens the foreground. Adding additional light removes most of the shadows in the immediate area while creating new ones in the distance. This photograph is central to this research project since it visualizes a deeper insight into the meaning of shadows cast by artificial light at night. The image allows for a conceptualization of light that goes beyond illumination itself. It has a distinct cast shadow that falls across a lit window on the ground floor of a building. The shadow is contrasted with the light emanating from the apartment. It is a simple but powerful contrast that shows twice how darkness increases and recedes from light. First, the shadow cast by the tree, caused by street light, is present in space as a carrier of urban darkness. Second, the cast shadow is interrupted, hollowed out by a further light source, namely the backlight of the apartment window. The image gives testimony of the succession of light and shadow, creating and dissolving each other. The attached shadow establishes an ambience of dark light. Attached shadows describe the shadows on the object, not thrown and cast, that is, detached onto another surface. These are shadows that form volume and body. They contrast with the cast shadow, which projects its shape onto another surface or body. Attached shadows add mass and texture in contrast to the cast shadow, which appears flat. The attached shadow appears in the area that is not directly illuminated. One of my earliest attempts to also one of the most satisfying to capture a multi-layered composition of darkness took place in Victoria Park in London. The photo provides more information to a greater range of darkness than I had previously achieved. The image reveals barely perceptible traces of light ambience and their shadows in the park. Subtle details come into play. Tree trunks stand out on the bench at the bottom left of the image is discernible. The paradox here lies in the sense that this photograph represents invisible qualities of nocturnal atmospheres of darkness in an image precisely by not exactly revealing them. This is another image of a tree at night. The voluminous presence of the tree manifests itself in the illuminated and unilluminated structure of the leaves. Multiple light sources create a field of shadows on the leaves, a textured space in between the binary of light and dark. These belong to the category of attached shadows. These shades differ from cast shadows because they trace within the tree's shadow, giving the tree body volume, weight, and texture. The overcast shadow causes an atmosphere in the air. Finally, I use the overcast shadow, the third typology of shadow, to describe the volume in the shadow itself. Like the sky on a cloudy day, the overcast shadow defines spatial atmospheric conditions. If we think of a parasol casting a shadow, the overcast shadow defines the spatial situation between the shade on the ground, that is, cast shadow, and the parasol, that is, the object and its attached shadow. The overcast shadow also describes tonality, diffusion, and movement, making it the most complicated of the three types of shadow. This image visualizes an aesthetic atmospheric appearance of urban darkness after midnight. Although barely noticeable, the ambient night light is tangible, visible in the air through a combination of fog and small refractions of artificial streetlights. One way to capture the matter of this night ambient is, paradoxically, to add extra light. For this photo, I used my camera flash to interrupt darkness, augmenting the street lightning in illuminating the scene. In the image, the atmosphere is translated into an aesthetic image. It takes on a new and different form. It is still visually quite tangible, even if it's not accurate. This visual insight contributes to a wider spatial understanding of the urban light design and darkness, particularly the architectural interplay of solid and non-solid entities. This allows for a broader phenomenological understanding of the aesthetic experience of darkness in space versus urban priorities in dealing with light at night. My third and last image of a tree visualizes an urban light atmosphere at night. The photograph combines the three sorts of shadows I have outlined so far. First, the cast shadow here appears on the surface of the house facade. Second, the attached shadows are found in the leaves of the tree. Finally, overcast is the barely visible but perceptible atmosphere unfolding between the tree, the house, and the lamp. The image traces the empty space, the air in between light and darkness. It is the shadow that belongs both to the visible and to the apparent space of the street lamp. The atmosphere within its setting, the variations and tonal shifts come to the fore when you really investigate the shadows themselves. The light coming from the street light in the left top corner leaves bright, nebulous traces that are spread over the entire image. The traces of light contrast with the dark surroundings. These traces cannot be assigned to an object since they float in space. James Gibson reflects on the environmental condition created by ambient light. He claims that light cannot be seen as such, though seeing the environment cannot simply be based on seeing light. According to Gibson, light as such, without the material surface of which to reflect or through which to refract, is empty, since there is nothing to be perceived. There is no information available. Hence, light reflections and those also shadows of an urban night illumination are emerging in a spatial presence that is not simply associated with a particular object, space, or area. To conclude, I have shown that there is a multitude of shadow perceptions beyond the domineering cast shadow, a perspective that I believe requires a fundamental re-examination of the history of the shadow, especially as it's conveyed in visual and design practice in the West. From this point of view, I have developed connections between visual language, photography, light, architecture, and urban darkness. The camera lens helps me to redirect the viewer's gaze towards the inconsequential, seemingly unimportant thing. Darkness in the form of shadows is one of them. What interests me are the visual dynamics of light in the urban night, clashing with ideas of what light does and what it should or could mean. My overall goal is to show a pictorial and spatial revision towards a phenomenology of the shadow. Shadows that create dark environments must be understood holistically, visibly, physically, mentally, to rehabilitate our relationship to the dark. My trilogy of shadows to understand how darkness unfolds, cast, attached, and overcast, can help expand this understanding. Hence, the absence of light is also the presence of light. Thank you so much for listening.